Good morning, Professor. Thank you very much for spending this time, a few minutes with me this morning about a legal subject that I wanted to talk to you about. You were my law professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. You're still a professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. And so I remembered how thoroughly you explained things in school. So I thought of coming back to you with regard to this specific question.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I'm happy to participate.
Thank you very much. May I ask what, I remember you taught property law when I was at Thomas Jefferson. Are you still teaching that, or what topics do you teach now?
I'm still teaching property law. That's my primary interest. So I probably told you at the time that I worked at the Justice Department for about 5 years before I got into teaching. Right. And I did a lot of antitrust work dealing with intellectual property at the time. So that's my number one interest. But when I was in private practice, I also did a good bit of criminal work. And so in recent years, I've started teaching criminal procedure. I taught the substantive criminal law course a little bit when I first started teaching. I haven't done that in a long time now, but I have done criminal procedure a few times in the past couple of years.
That's wonderful. So this might actually lead us to the topic of today. And I'm just today is gonna be 1-2 question interview. And my question is this, and this is not a political challenge, this is purely a legal question for me and for people that I like to present this video to. So the events that took place in Oregon, Portland, about a few months ago. So we have protests happening. And so what happens is police comes into the game. This is a state matter. State is controlling the population that are protesting and is providing for peaceful events. At some point, and this, I think this just happened in Oregon. My understanding is that this just happened in Portland. We had federal agents, DHS officers, coming into Portland. And when I read about it, I read that some of these are Border Patrol agents, some of these are ICE agents that are being brought from other parts of the country to Portland in order to control the demonstration. So my first question is pretty much a constitutional law question. Isn't it a state matter to control and provide for peace within the state? Why are federal officers coming into a state acting as police officers of that state?
That's an excellent question. As you know, our Constitution sets up a federalist system in which each state is an independent sovereign that has, under the Constitution, authority over any matter that is not where authority is not specifically given to the federal government by the Constitution itself.
Right.
And nothing in the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to intervene and take over a protest or demonstration or even something that turns violent. Nothing in the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to come in and take over management of that. There's nothing that does it. Now, arguably, the federal government does have authority over federal property. And so I know that one of the issues was, well, if protest is happening on federal property within a state, could the federal government then intervene? I think that's arguable. There's nothing specific in the Constitution that would address that, but you could at least make a reasonable analogy that because the federal government has the right to establish certain federal facilities, like a post office, for example, if a protest was somehow threatening the operation of that post office, the federal government could arguably do something. But the idea of intervening in protests where there's no direct threat to something where the federal government has constitutional authority, that that is an unconstitutional practice. And I think it's been made doubly concerning here when either the identity of the federal officers is not clearly known,
Yes.
or where that identity is directly connected to the military, because the United States military is not supposed to be used for domestic purposes.
Right. So the way I understood the facts, the way I observed it, was that this kind of went beyond the perimeter of the federal property that they initially was in question. They kind of went into the crowd, they arrested people, and in effect, they're acting as the police force of that city. And so that kind of rose a question for me, how the federal government walks into a city and acts as the police. And why does the state not do anything about it? Why did the state, the city mayor or the governor not protest or allow this to happen?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with you that this is my understanding of what happened as well. And I think even beyond sort of acting as the local police force, the federal forces acted in ways that seem to be quite clearly unconstitutional. That is, picking people up without probable cause to believe that they committed specific crimes, and then never charging them. That sort of conduct is clearly illegal and very hard to do anything about, because in the typical way that illegal police conduct is discouraged is through the exclusionary rule. But if you don't charge anyone with anything, right, the exclusionary rule has no meaning. And so the only possibility would be filing tort claims against the officers who misbehaved, and that would take us into a whole nother issue of qualified immunity and how that works. In response to your question, I can only speculate as to why the state officials did as little as they did. I mean, from my understanding, they protested the introduction of federal forces into the city and the state, but they didn't try to take any legal action to block it. Right. And I can only speculate, but my sense of it was that they just had more to worry about at that point in trying to figure out how to manage the situation in such a way that the federal forces would not make it worse, because that seemed to be the problem there for a while, that rather than helping the situation, the federal forces were sort of inflaming it and making it worse. And so I think their just focus on was, how can we bring this situation under control, reach a situation of where peaceful protests can go on without interference, and they were focused on it from that direction. But I think it would make a very interesting very interesting civil rights case. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution very explicitly says that all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And there's no explicit power in the federal government to police conduct within a state. So it would make for an interesting challenge.
Would you mind elaborating on what the exclusionary rule is for our audience?
Sure. The exclusionary rule was a rule developed by the United States Supreme Court in the 20th century that said that if the police come upon a piece of evidence, whether it is physical evidence or testimonial evidence from a defendant or a witness, if the police come upon that evidence through practices that violate the Constitution, for example, if someone's home is searched without a warrant, then the exclusionary rule says that the prosecution cannot use that evidence in its case in chief to prove that the defendant is guilty of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. That rule was adopted for federal prosecutions in the early 20th century. And then in the very famous case of Mapp versus Ohio, that rule was extended to apply to all prosecutions in state courts as well.
Thank you. Um, protests happen all across the country. It wasn't just in Portland. And another question for me was, and maybe you don't know the answer, but why did the federal officers decide to go into Portland and not into other cities that had similar situations? Why this state and why not other states?
I do not know the answer to that question. And, again, I can only speculate, but, one has to think that, with this administration, a lot of times what happens is because of what they believe would be the effect on publicity and how it would influence public sentiment. So, while I don't have any information to know that for a fact, I would suspect and be concerned that there was a calculation that doing this in Portland would have an impact on sort of the overall state of the country with respect to the election, and that's why it was done there.
I did grow up in Germany myself, and when you grow up in Germany, you read a lot about the German history. And one thing that I remembered was the secret police that the Nazis had during their era called Gestapo, which is basically this catch-all police force that goes everywhere unmarked and does everything they want. And this conduct of unmarked officers marching into territory of a city, acting as their local police officers, reminded me a little bit of the era of Gestapo, where you have unmarked officers going anywhere and just do whatever they want and there's no accountability. So this was a little alarming for me as to where things are going. So that's why I wanted to understand the legality of the situation and come to you to see where things are. Do you feel this pattern will be repeated? Again, you don't know that. It's just an opinion. Or is this a one-time situation?
So I believe that the federal government will be reluctant to repeat this situation because, again, my speculation that it was done the way it was done because of the anticipated effect on public sentiment. And I feel largely because of, interviews like this and people, with concern about it, making their voices heard, I think that it's really had the opposite effect, that most people have thought that, this is improper for the federal government to do this. There's no authority to do it. If a state requests assistance from the federal government, that's an entirely different story. But for the federal government to do this, and, as you say, with unmarked police officers, I remember in Washington, D.C., when there's obviously more grounds there for using federal forces to do things because there's a lot of federal property and buildings and all that. But the officers that were brought in were unidentified. And even when the press asked them who they were, they refused to identify themselves. And so, yeah, that's incredibly concerning. And just an anecdote that it bothers me so much, and so I want to mention it, is, there's video of when Lafayette Park, the area right across the street from the White House, was cleared of protesters so that the president could walk across to the church that's across the street. And in that video, there's a very commonly viewed sequence where a police officer takes some sort of a battering ram device that he had, and he just pummels a news cameraman with that battering ram to get the cameraman out of the way. Obviously someone who wasn't being violent at all. And if you watch the video, I mean, he was trying to move out of the way as he was being beaten. And a couple of other officers come along and they kind of get the one officer who was beating the reporter to get off of him. And the reporter was a cameraman, and presumably it was a female reporter who was working with him. The two of them start moving away in the direction that the officers were trying to move the people. And this part of the video is usually not shown. It's usually cut off. But an entirely different officer from the one who was using the battering device and the cameraman, takes his billy club and hits the woman in the back with the club as she is trying to run away in the direction the police are trying to move them. And it's just so offensive that, you know, that unidentified officers would behave that way. And in my view, so, you know, that sort of aspect of the video hasn't been brought out enough. So I just wanted to mention it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that kind of goes along with the topic of today. So this kind of wraps up my question for you today. Is there anything you would like to add in conclusion to this topic?
I just would like to thank you for having me on and for you know, getting information out there about the legal issues that surround this sort of behavior. It's a great thing that you're doing, and I'm happy to participate.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time, Professor. Hopefully we can catch up soon with regard to other legal issues coming up.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Have a great day. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.